Alright, so we will finish up with the Reconstruction era, which is a rather sad part of our history. Like, you'd think just after Civil War, we freed the slaves, everything's hunky-dory, right? Nope. Beginning with the assassination of Lincoln, our next period did not go so well. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, and then after that we'll play our Jeopardy game, and then we'll cut the camera and maybe relax for the rest of the lesson. Here we go for this.
I mean, this is Crash Course U.S. History, and huzzah! The Civil War is over! The slaves are free! Huzzah! That would hit me in the head. Dangerous Crash Course. So when you say don't name it a person, that includes myself? Roller coaster only goes up from here, my friends. Huzzah! Mr. Green, what about the epic failure of Reconstruction? Oh, right. Stupid Reconstruction always ruining everything. So after the Civil War ended, the United States had to reintegrate both a formerly slave population and a formerly rebellious population back into the country, which is a challenge that we might have met, except Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and we were left with Andrew Lyman, the third worst president ever, Johnson. I'm sorry, but you don't get to be in the show anymore. So Lincoln's whole post-war idea was to facilitate reunion and reconciliation, and Andrew Johnson's guiding Reconstruction principle was that the South never had a right to secede in the first place. Also, because he was himself a Southerner, he resented all the elites in the South who had snubbed him, and he was also a racist who didn't think that blacks should have any role in Reconstruction. Trifecta! So between 1865 and 1867, the so-called period of presidential Reconstruction, Johnson appointed provisional governors and ordered them to call state conventions to establish new, all-white governments. And in their 100% whiteness and oppression of former slaves, those new governments looked suspiciously like the old Confederate governments they had replaced. And what was changing for the former slaves? Well, in some ways, a lot. Like Fisk and Howard universities were established, as well as many primary and secondary schools, thanks in part to the Freedmen's Bureau, which only lasted until 1870, but had the power to divide up confiscated and abandoned Confederate land for former slaves. And this was very important because to most slaves, land ownership was the key to freedom, and many felt like they'd been promised land by the Union Army, like General Sherman's Field Order 15 promised to distribute land in 40-acre plots to former slaves. But that didn't happen either through the Freedmen's Bureau or anywhere else. Instead, President Johnson ordered all land returned to its former owners, so the South remained largely agricultural, with the same people owning the same land, and in the end, we ended up with sharecropping. Let's go to the thought bubble. The system of sharecropping replaced slavery in many places throughout the South.
So I'm going to talk a little about sharecropping. He's going to explain it, but kind of my take on it is essentially that sharecropping is where an African American could own land, but that particular land was also under the jurisdiction of usually former plantation owners, and pretty much anything that those plantation owners said had to go, because it was like if they owned the land or whatever, then the African Americans had to do whatever that plantation owner said. So it kind of is reminiscent of what? Slavery. It's kind of going right back into that. Now, as it happened, both blacks and white sharecroppers were involved in this, and so they both suffered from it. And I think by the 1900s, it was mostly white sharecroppers. But yeah, so this whole system kind of went right back into slavery under a different name. Now, as far as I know, a lot of the beatings and all that weren't happening the same way they would have back in the slave period. But at this point, the slaves, or excuse me, the blacks were still kind of, you know, tied to their landowners. So sharecropping was not a great upgrade from where they had been.
Landowners would provide housing to the sharecroppers. No, thought bubble, not quite that nice.
Tiny
there
houses.
you go.
Yep.
Also tools and seed, and then the sharecroppers received, get this, a share of their crop, usually between a third and a half, with the price for that harvest often set by the landowner.
Right, with the landowner often being former plantation owner. Now imagine this: if you worked your finger to the bone for your own food, your own crops, your own materials, you did all the work, and then you only get to keep a little bit of that, and the rest goes to the person who was the bigger landowner. How would you feel about that? Pretty bad, right? Yeah. I mean, it's essentially they spent all of their time trying to make a living and couldn't. So
Freed blacks got to control their work, and plantation owners got a steady workforce that couldn't easily leave because they had little opportunity to save money and make the big capital investments in like land or tools. By the late 1860s, poor white farmers were sharecropping as well. In fact, by the Great Depression, most sharecroppers were white. And while sharecropping certainly wasn't slavery, it did result in a quasi-serfdom that tied workers to land they didn't own, more or less the opposite of Jefferson's ideal of the small, independent farmer. So the Republicans in Congress weren't happy that this reconstructed South looked so much like the pre-Civil War South, so they see the powers of the national government expanded. Few were as radical as Thaddeus Tommy Lee Jones Stevens, who wanted to take away land from the southern planters and give it to the former slaves. But rank-and-file Republicans were radical enough to pass the Civil Rights Bill, which defined persons born in the United States as citizens and established nationwide equality before the law, regardless of race. Andrew Johnson immediately vetoed the law, claiming that trying to protect the rights of African Americans amounted to discrimination against white people, which so infuriated Republicans that Congress did something it had never done before in all of American history. They overrode the presidential veto with a 2/3 majority, and the Civil Rights Act became law. So then Congress really had its dammer up and decided to amend the Constitution with the 14th Amendment, which defines citizenship, guarantees equal protection, and extends the rights in the Bill of Rights to all the states, sort of. The amendment had almost no Democratic support, but it also didn't need any, because there were almost no Democrats in Congress on account of how Congress had refused to seat the representatives from the new all-white governments that Johnson supported. And that's how we got the 14th Amendment, arguably the most important in the whole Constitution. Thanks, Doctor. Oh, straight to the mystery document there? All right. The rules here are simple. I guess the author of the mystery document and try not to get shocked. All right, let's see what we got today. Section 1. Be it ordained by the police jury of the parish of St. Landry that no Negro shall be allowed to pass within limits of said parish without special permit in writing from his employer. Section 4. Every Negro is required to be in the regular service of some white person who shall be held responsible for the conduct of said Negro. Section 6. No Negro shall be permitted to preach, exhort, or otherwise declaim to congregations of colored people without a special permission in writing from the president of the police jury. Gee, Stan, I wonder if the president of the police jury was white. I actually know this one. It is a black code, which was basically legal codes, but they just...
He's probably about to allude to it. So basically what these were is, instead of saying the word slave, they used the word Negro. And they used other words too, which I will not repeat. But essentially, they just redefined it and reworded it, and it was the same thing. So even though these slaves were, quote, free, they really still didn't have rights in the South in any capacity. And so these codes were passed to kind of ensure that. So
replaced the word slave with the word Negro. And this code shows just how unwilling white governments were to ensure the rights of new free citizens. I would celebrate not getting shocked, but now I am depressed. So okay, in 1867, again over Johnson's veto, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act, which divided the South into 5 military districts and required each state to create a new government, one that included participation of black men. Those new governments had to ratify the 14th Amendment if they wanted to get back into the Union. Radical Reconstruction had begun. So in 1868, Andrew Johnson was about as electable in the U.S. as Jefferson Davis, and sure enough, he didn't win. Instead, the 1868 election was won by Republican and former Union General Ulysses S. Grant. But Grant's margin of victory was small enough that Republicans were like, man, we would sure win more elections if black people could vote, which is something you hear Republicans say all the time these days. So congressional Republicans pushed through the 15th Amendment, which prohibited states from denying men the right to vote based on race, but not based on gender or literacy or whether your grandfather could vote. So states ended up with a lot of leeway when it came to denying the franchise to African Americans, which of course they did. So here we have the federal government dictating who can vote and who is and isn't a citizen of a state, and establishing equality under the law, even the local laws. And this is a really big deal in American history because the national government became, rather than a threat to individual liberty, the custodian of freedom, as radical Republican Charles Sumner put it. So with this legal protection, former slaves began to exercise their rights. They participated in the political process by direct action, such as staging sit-ins to integrate streetcars, by voting in elections, and by holding office. Most African Americans were Republicans at the time, and because they could vote and were a large part of the population, the Republican Party came to dominate politics in the South, just like today, except totally different. Now, Southern mythology about the age of radical Reconstruction is exemplified by Gone with the Wind, which of course tells the story of Northern Republican dominance and corruption by Southern Republicans. Fortune-seeking Northern carpetbaggers seen here, as well as Southern turncoat scalawags, dominated politics, and all of the African-American elected leaders were either corrupt or puppets or both. Yeah, well, like the rest of Gone with the Wind, that's a bit of an oversimplification. There were about 2,000 African-Americans who held office during Reconstruction, and the vast majority of them were not corrupt. Consider, for example, the not corrupt and amazingly named Pinckney B.S. Pinchback, who from 1872 to 1873 served very briefly in Louisiana as America's first black governor, and went on to be a senator and a member of the House of Representatives. By the way, America's second African-American governor, Douglas Wilder of Virginia, was elected in 1989. Having African-American office holders was a huge step forward in terms of of ensuring the rights of African Americans, because it meant that there would be black juries and less discrimination in state and local governments when it came to providing basic services. But in the end, Republican governments failed in the South. There were important achievements, especially a school system that, while segregated, did attempt to educate both black and white children. And even more importantly, they created a functioning government where both white and African American citizens could participate. According to one white South Carolina lawyer, we have gone through one of the most remarkable changes in our relations to each other that has been known perhaps in the history of the world. That's a little hyperbolic, but we are America after all. It's true that corruption was widespread, but it was in the North too. I mean, we're talking about governments. And that's not why Reconstruction really ended. It ended because, one, things like schools and road repair cost money, which meant taxes, which made Republican governments very unpopular because Americans hate taxes. And two, white Southerners could not accept African Americans exercising basic civil rights, holding office, or voting. And for many, the best way to return things to the way they were before Reconstruction was through violence. Especially after 1867, much of the violence directed toward African Americans in the South was politically motivated. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1866, and it quickly became a terrorist organization targeting Republicans, both black and white, beating and murdering men and women in order to intimidate them and keep them from voting.
And regarding the Ku Klux Klan, that is something a lot of people don't realize at the time. A lot of people think, well, the KKK was only attacking black people. It was attacking black people, but it was actually also attacking white people. Anyone who essentially disagreed with their political premise were targets, because they felt like if they could inspire fear and terror, they could switch people to their opinion, and obviously pretty much had the opposite effect. But yeah, that's a lot of people don't realize that about the Ku Klux Klan. So.
This was probably the massacre at Colfax, Louisiana, where hundreds of former slaves were murdered. And between intimidation and emerging discriminatory voting laws, fewer black men voted, which allowed white Democrats to take control of state governments in the South and return white Democratic congressional delegations to Washington. These white Southern politicians called themselves redeemers because they claimed to have redeemed the South from Northern Republican corruption and black rule. Now, it's likely that the South would have fallen back into Democratic hands eventually, but the process was aided by Northern Republicans losing interest in Reconstruction. In 1873, the U.S. fell into yet another not quite great economic depression, and Northerners lost the stomach to fight for the rights of black people in the South, which, in addition to being hard, was expensive. So by 1876, the supporters of Reconstruction were in full retreat, and the Democrats were resurgent, especially in the South. And this set up one of the most contentious elections in American history. The Democrats nominated New York Governor and NYU Law School graduate Samuel Tilden. The Republicans chose Ohio Governor and Kenyon College alumnus Rutherford B. Hayes. One man who had gone to crash course writer Raoul Myers Law School, and another who had gone to my college, Kenyon. Now, if this election had been based on facial hair, as elections should be, there would have been no controversy. But sadly, we have an electoral college here in the United States, and in 1876, there were disputed electoral votes in South Carolina, Louisiana, and of course, Florida. Now, you may remember that in these situations, there is a constitutional provision that says Congress should decide the winner, but Congress shockingly proved unable to accomplish something. So they appointed a 15-man electoral commission, a super committee, if you will, and there were 8 Republicans on that committee and 7 Democrats. So never guess who won. Kenyon College's own Rutherford B. Hayes.
So this is a really interesting point in history, and also kind of shows that discrepancy that we still have between the popular vote and the Electoral College. If I remember correctly, Rutherford B. Hayes actually lost the popular vote by about 300,000, which at that time was a lot of people. And I think he won the Electoral College by 1, maybe 2 or 3 votes. If I remember the number correctly, I might be wrong on that. But basically, he won by that much, and really because there just happened to be more Republicans than Democrats, and just lucky him. So it kind of shows how, while our political system has a lot of checks and balances, it's not perfect. It can always be on a teetering edge sometimes.
Friends and ladies! And yes, that is our mascot. Shut up. Anyway, in order to get the presidency and win the support of the super committee, Hayes' people agreed to cede control of the South to the Democrats and to stop meddling in Southern affairs, and also to build a transcontinental railroad through Texas. This is called the Bargain of 1877 because historians are so good at naming things, and it basically killed Reconstruction. Without any more federal troops in Southern states and with control of Southern legislatures firmly in the hands of white Democrats, the states were free to go back to restricting the freedom of black people, which they did. Legislatures passed Jim Crow laws that limited African Americans' access to public accommodations and legal protections. States passed laws that took away black people's right to vote, and social and economic mobility among African Americans in the South declined precipitously. However, for a brief moment, the United States was more democratic than it had the 1950s and 1960s, sometimes called the Second Reconstruction. But we're going to end this episode on a downer, as we are wont to do here at Crash Course U.S. History, because I want to point out a lesser-known legacy of Reconstruction. The Reconstruction amendments and laws that were passed granted former slaves political freedom and rights, especially the vote, and that was critical. But to give them what they really wanted and needed, plots of land that would make them economically independent, would have required confiscation, and that violation of property rights was too much for all but the most radical Republicans. And that question of what it really means to be free in a system of free market capitalism has proven very complicated indeed. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is directed by Stan Moore.
So that being said, how did y'all feel about that event after the Civil War?
Well, it's definitely very sad. Like, I've heard stories about the KKK, like was it our great grandma who yelled at the KKK about
When our dad was really little.
our they had like a nanny, and she was trying to get to their house, and there was like a KKK.
Our dad's from Alabama. So
Yeah, so we have a lot of experience, like, well, not experience personally, but they wouldn't let their nanny get to the house. So our grandma drove up there with our dad in the back seat and started yelling at these full-grown men. Like, it was just such a funny story because we're like, you can yell at them. It was just super funny.
Well, it's interesting you mention that because both of my parents came from the North, so they didn't deal with the KKK, at all during their childhood. But I had grown up listening to stories from people who lived here and their grandparents and them dealing with the KKK. And it was interesting because for them, a lot of people in the KKK weren't secretive. They would wear the pillowcases and stuff, but that was more of like a political statement that they weren't really hiding who they were, and they were openly supportive of it, especially during the 60s and the 50s. And you have these major political splits where you just see neither side as being apologetic for what they believe in. And you had radical movements on both sides. You had the Black Panthers, you had the KKK, just these more extremist movements. You had individuals such as Malcolm X, Luther King, and they're all starting to come up. Martin Luther King obviously being probably the most influential in a good way, in a positive way. He was much more about peace and trying to find equality and equal treatment. And really, a lot of these issues would not get directly addressed until Martin Luther King kind of stepped into the picture. I think you kind of started seeing that, okay, we've got to start dealing with this. And I'm trying to remember, it was Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson who were presidents during this time, I think. Because also, another big event was happening right around the same time, which y'all probably can guess.
I want to say it's a Great Depression, but
No. 50s and 60s. This is like 20, 30 years later. Certain conflicts going on in Southeast Asia between us and
Asia? Okay.
Yeah.
I have no clue.
Vietnam.
Oh, okay, that makes so much sense.
So that was all happening all at the same time. So the country was heavily divided over war, anti-war, race, racist, and it was a major controversial time period between the 50s and 60s. The 50s were a little bit more stable because it was right after World War II, and so at that time, America was 1950s America. It was the perfect example of America, little Georgie's, Doctor's ice cream, that kind of thing. It was very much. By the 60s, a lot of that had been done away with. You had these movements like the hippie movements and stuff like that, and it's just completely changing the dynamic in the political system of America. But there were a lot of good things that did come from it, such as we did go through a civil rights period where the rights of African Americans were finally realized in many ways. So that was an upside. But yeah, sadly, Reconstruction, you would think, would have solved everything. So it was like, oh, well, it's after the war, we've dealt with the problem, we fought a whole war over this, hundreds of thousands of men died. Obviously, the solution's there, and it just didn't happen. A lot of the reason it may not have happened is because Lincoln was killed almost immediately before this period started. So it kind of threw a complete wrench into the whole plan, the Reconstruction plan. And then, like you said, you had Andrew Johnson, who was the exact opposite of Lincoln. So it was kind of the worst thing that could have happened for this movement. Alright, let's move into Jeopardy, and this will be the last, I think we're on our last week, so week 8. So, let's see, we were going to do this one, I think it'd be more fun just to have like individuals, and just, well, no, you know what, we keep our numbers even, but I want to mix it up, because we've been doing the same teams for a while, so let's put the Renneman sisters together and see if they can win. Put Hannah and Abby, mix them up, and then CC and Caleb. I don't think we've had these teams yet, so let's see how this goes. All right. Now, to make this fun for the last week, I will not deduct points if you guess. But if a team wants to refute it and they think they have a better answer, I'll let them try for it. Alright, so let's go right in the middle this time and let Team 2 pick. Alright, Cece, you can pick. No pressure.
True or false, 300.
True or false, 300. Lincoln demonstrated a callous disregard for those in the North who actively participated in the struggle.
False.
So, indeed, because essentially it's the side he was on. So, alrighty. Good start, Team 2.
Yes, cut across.
Oh, okay, lecture 300.
Lecture 300, alright. Whose political strategy was described as taking what you can get now and then going back for more until you have the ideal? So whose political strategy was described as taking what you can get now and then going back for more until you have the ideal?
Abraham Lincoln?
Okay, does anyone want to try and go against it? Remember, you won't lose
Abraham Lincoln.
points.
I feel like he had the emancipation proclamation, and that was what he could get.
Maybe.
So he did that.
Anyone want to agree with that? I mean, we won't gain points since he guessed it, but maybe he guessed it. Who knows? I was just seeing if anybody would other. Okay. So in this case, it is Lincoln.
Yes.
Yes. Very good. So Caleb is running it. Did you actually read the chapter? Oh man.
I listened to the lectures, I didn't read it.
I
didn't read it. I didn't read
those. Alright, Team 2, you're on the go right here.
300 minutes.
Oh, we are cutting in the middle.
No,
I feel like I want to be.
This time Caleb is messing it up.
I feel like I want to be a journalist. Like, oh, lecture 100? Okay. The removal of the Southern Democratic majority in Congress hastened the this of the West.
The expansion?
Yep, expansion, development.
Okay.
Yep, the development of the West.
This is why we didn't do individuals.
Yeah. Alright, so I'll tell you what, just to keep it interesting, let's let one of the other teams pick. Because otherwise it might be one-sided. Alright, Team 1, let's you pick.
Guys, let's cut across. Let's do cut across, please. Okay, let's do famous Americans 400.
No.
Yeah.
You go crazy.
Yeah, there we go. She ruined it. This poet lived through the entire Civil War without ever writing about it.
This was, I believe it was Emily Dickinson.
It is Emily Dickinson. Very good.
That's my own project. I haven't.
Very good. This is one that is interesting because she lived through the entire war, was an American poet / author, and never directly wrote about the war. I think she alluded to it a few times, but really it didn't make it focus. So, alrighty, Team 3. I'll let y'all pick this
Famous
one.
Americans 300.
Well, it's too late now.
We can still do
It was
that.
pretty
He was the only Southerner to remain in the Senate in 1861.
I'm gonna be just watch this, right?
I don't think so.
No. I thought it was in the lecture we just watched.
No, I think it's the reading. There's everybody
Well, it's definitely in the reading because all these questions are either from lectures or readings.
Answer. You got this.
You want to go for
Let
it?
me know.
I was like, my answer's really gonna be less down.
I have no idea.
I think you can see it.
I don't know.
Can we skip? His name is Andrew or something. I'm guessing not Andrew. Everyone else is Andrew.
Well, let's see. Andrew Johnson.
We just watched.
Yeah, it was.
Good job.
I didn't want to drop the him, but you should have just gone for it. Because remember, you don't lose points, so you just go Andrew Johnson. Alright, so let's give Team 2 a chance to pick again.
We could grab back 300 and then true or false 400.
Yeah, she's down there.
Grab back 300.
We're trying to redeem ourselves, Gracie. Thank you.
You're
What
welcome.
does Johnson call this? The trademark of Civil War surgery. This is the author, Paul Johnson.
Is it amputation?
It is. It's amputations.
Yes.
Yep. Very good. Very good. So that was pretty much most of the job in the Civil War for surgeons was amputating arms and legs. I'm trying not to be too gross, but essentially one of the worst things about Civil War is they did not have germ and penicillin or anything that could fight
They didn't
germs.
have any medicine to keep the
The infections out. Yeah, so essentially gangrene was extremely common. If you broke skin and you got wounded, it would just fester and infect. It would actually smell really bad. Not to be super gross, but if you ever had an infection or something and you smelled that weird odor, that was rampant. It was really, really stinky. So they would have to cut off the limb to prevent the gangrene from spreading up into the body, so to poison the rest of the body. And that was just extremely common. The worst part about it is they didn't just chop it off, they had to saw it off.
And they were awake.
They were awake the whole time. They had no painkillers, no nothing. They would often drink like whiskey or something to, quote, help the pain, but it really didn't do that much. I mean, you're still sawing, yeah, so it was very, very gruesome. There's a scene from Dances with Wolves, like literally the opening scene where they're showing that, and it's gruesome. It's like,
Oh, they may know that.
Alright, but hey, good job, team 1, so you get to pick.
Wait, what?
I'll be nice and say true or false. True or false for me.
Thank you.
It also brings like new meanings to the Civil War. It literally cost an arm and a leg. Sorry, that was me. Johnson considers the Radical Republicans' second Reconstruction extreme and practical.
True.
Okay. It was true. Very good.
I knew that.
So, at the time, while you could argue that it was with the right intentions, they were going to some pretty big extremes, and they weren't compromising a lot of issues, which, quite frankly, at this time period they needed to do in order to ease into the Reconstruction. They were kind of like, nope, it's this or nothing. So it was arguably extreme and impractical, even though it was also arguably morally right in a lot of ways. Okay, let's see, Team 2, you're owning it right now. So.
True or false 200.
All right, true or false 200. The Ku Klux Klan exclusively attacked black voters.
False.
It is false, yeah.
Ha, got it. I knew I had to.
It was close. She got it over, so yeah.
Whatever.
It's false. They attacked black and white. All right, Team 3.
Famous Americans 200.
Famous Americans 200.
Yeah.
All right, he was a major proponent in the South of using slaves to fight by the end of the war, according to Johnson.
I don't know.
Is it Grant? Because I heard.
Well, he was a major proponent in the South.
Ooh.
This is not a
It's
northern
not
case.
Grant. It's not Grant. What do you do?
Generally.
So,
Generally.
generally close. He was actually Jefferson Davis, is the president of the South at the time. So yeah, obviously not the best idea to get the slaves to fight for the right to stay slaves. Probably not the smartest idea. So, alrighty, let's see. Let's mix it up and go Team 1.
Could you do like the 100s and then the 500s?
Yes.
I feel like you should just cause utter chaos.
No.
I swear.
Yeah, we'll do events 500.
Events 500.
Oh, okay, that was.
Getting Congress to pass the 13th Amendment was Lincoln's first practical stance toward this.
Slavery.
No.
Lincoln's
Abolition.
So what?
Abolition or
Broader
slavery?
Reconstruction.
I think I meant that, right?
Yeah. Abolition and Reconstruction, the exact
Same
same
thing.
So you were along the right track, so just not quite on it. Kind of like skirting the line a bit like. So all right, let's let Team 3 pick one.
We gotta go with events 100 now.
Yeah.
Love how all of you are OCD. Johnson feels that this event had a dramatic impact on virtually everyone in the North. It clearly changed the way that they looked at the
Was it
world.
Reconstruction?
Not quite. It's a little bit easier than that. It's the Civil War. It was an easy one. That's the reason it was 100. It was about as easy as I could make it. It was like, this was a big event in terms of violence that happened during the 1800s. So, alrighty. Team 2. Let's let you pick.
Either 500 or 100. Pick one in the corner.
Lecture 500.
Lecture 500. Lincoln's plan for Reconstruction was described in the lectures as what? One word. If you watch the lectures, you click on it.
Good.
Huh? Good.
I didn't watch the lectures.
What? What was that? Did you just say die? That wasn't his plan for Reconstruction, though.
Yeah, but no, would it,
Yes, he planned his own death.
Yeah, I guess we have Reconstruction. Short. killing. So no. Generous, actually, yes. He was going to be generous to both sides, actually, as far as because his goal was not to like further the conflict. Once the war was over, he wanted to find a way to peacefully, kind of gradually go in. And sadly, his dream was just cut short. It's interesting because he was killed by John Wilkes Booth, who actually, when he shot him, uttered the phrase "Sic Semper Tyrannis," which meant "thus for tyrants." So it was part of the Southern view that Lincoln was a tyrant, while arguably, technically, a dictator. Probably wasn't a tyrant. You know, there's a dictator at a time where a dictator takes power and uses that power for one way or the other, and then a tyrant is someone who uses it in a selfish manner. So tyrant's pretty much always negative. Dictator can be positive depending on the situation. All right, so let's let Team 1 pick.
Let's do
Crazy.
events.
No!
Events 200. Yes. Chaos. It was here that Lee surrendered to Grant.
Waterloo.
No, it's
Yes. Maybe I say Waterloo was Napoleon. And he didn't surrender at Waterloo. Well, he kind of did. I guess he did, but it was it was Napoleon. Alrighty. Team 2.
You got it. Even it out.
Events 400, you think? No, I didn't say that.
No.
What?
At this point, you might as well just have fun.
Lecture 5.
Lecture 400. Here we go. By the time Reconstruction ended, white Southerners had accepted African American civil rights.
False.
False. Definitely not. Alrighty, Team 3.
Okay, grab back 500. We gotta do something to get on the bottom of these.
After John Wilkes Booth assassinated Lincoln, he uttered this phrase.
You just said
I just said it. What did I say?
Something. Tyrant.
Tyrante exclamante.
Tyrant! That's what you just basically said. Tyrant exclamante. Tyrant! Not quite. I'm actually, I want you to guess this right. I literally just opened the phrase.
It's
That's for retirement?
Death to the
I don't know how to
tyrant.
pronounce it. He was retired. And he's dead. I don't know. I give up.
I gave up.
Wow, that is so off the mark. It's like, that's for retirement. No. I cannot believe I have to do this. Sic Semper Tyrannis.
I would never heard of that.
I would never have known
Thus
that.
for tyrants. Well, you would have because I just said it. I literally just said it.
So I was kind of grieving over the fact that
Or thus for retirement. Yeah. Alright. Y'all are going to be history professors. Alright, let's give it to Team 2 then. So.
Okay, I think I gotta do the 400 and 100 and 100. Just to.
Yes.
I was also OCD about this.
True or false?
True or false?
Wait,
5. Okay, true or false 500. Here we go.
Oh, come
Jefferson Davis knew nothing about the assassination of President Lincoln before it happened.
on. Is this true or false?
True.
True. He really didn't. A lot of people thought that Jefferson Davis was directly involved because he was the president of the South. He did not know. He did not, as far as we know, he did not plan it. So, alrighty, Team 2.
Help me with it. Do the other one.
Game's not over. Y'all can still pull ahead.
True or false?
100.
True or false? 100.
Yeah, you said 500.
What?
Famous
There we go. The Congressional Reconstruction had little, if any, effect on white Southern voters. True.
Oh, that's false, right?
It's false.
Ah.
Yeah.
Gracie, what?
Gracie. I don't know anymore.
Why? Look at the question and what movie did we just watch? It's the Reconstruction, right? Did the Southerners really go for it?
No.
No. No, they did not.
Now you should be more
Okay,
clear.
there we
Y'all are
go.
just
Well, then you
All right.
Team 3, what's your pick?
What are we doing?
It's hopeless.
Okay, we gotta do the famous American 500. Just
Yeah.
clear the bottom part at least.
I'm gonna get rid of the 400.
This man allowed Davis to smuggle out his prison diary, the publication of which contributed to his eventual release. This may surprise you all.
Which one was
It's definitely a person you've heard of.
I'm gonna wildly guess something that's probably not even close, but just Abraham Lincoln.
Interesting guess, but no. Andrew Johnson.
That was my second
The president the guy who became president right after Lincoln. He was actually friends with Jefferson Davis. Yeah. So this kind of.
They always say
yeah.
stick your conscience, but my conscience was wrong.
So what?
They say stick with your conscience, but my conscience was wrong.
I mean, still more often right when you think about sticking with your gut. You tend to be more often right psychologically. All right, team 2. I'll let you. Or actually, team 1. I'll let you pick one.
Why would you let us do that? I would failing at this.
This is Jeopardy, by the way. There are categories and points. I'm sorry, I thought I had to explain this.
Let's just do famous Americans.
All right, famous Americans 100. This indecisive individual was the Democratic presidential candidate who ran against Lincoln in 1864. He didn't lose. He simply made fairly. Or he nearly won. It was McClellan. I still love that this guy ran against Lincoln. It's kind of like the guy who was the most indecisive military leader in American, or at least one of the most indecisive in American history, was not very popular. And he was like, yes, I'll be Lincoln, sure.
God, it was grace would have been in.
Yep. Famous for doing absolutely nothing. I wish I could be remembered in history for doing absolutely nothing. It's like Professor Belcher remembered for literally doing nothing, and he will be remembered for all time.
Amazing.
So. Alrighty, team 3. Who do you guys want to go cloud?
400? Which 400?
We could do grab bag.
Okay, grab bag 400.
Grab bag 400?
Yeah.
Robert E. Lee spent his final years at this university.
Is this our Harvard?
Again?
Oxford?
Georgia Tech.
Georgia Tech. Did you say that?
Georgia Tech? Maybe.
That's weird.
I really want to say
Yeah.
what?
That's
What's that one that
Oxford.
says that Oxford?
No, Oxford is that what you said?
So,
Wait, did I see that one that's like some word? It's like
Overland? Maybe.
It's not yesterday.
You're guessing Overland? Alright, we got a guess for Overland. It is Washington University. Yep,
Yeah,
sure.
totally guess that.
The interesting thing about Lee is that after the surrender of Appomattox, he was still pretty much held in high regard. Lee was a very respectful person, so he really wasn't viewed too negatively by a lot of leaders. Now, he was still leading the opposition, so there was that, but he definitely had a great demeanor that left him in good status. Okay, who should I pick? I'll let team 1 pick again.
Oh, look, something.
I know, doesn't it?
Let's do grab bag 100.
Grab that one.
No.
Yes.
Then you gotta do like 100 to 200,
Oh,
and then 100 to 200
No.
to 400.
These individuals in the West were usually heavily armed and cared nothing for official treaties with the Indians. This might surprise you too.
Cowboys?
Not quite. Not quite.
Cowgirl.
Think about I'll give you a hint. Think Georgia and California. What did they have in common?
Gold miners?
Miners. Yep.
That makes so much more sense now that I think about it.
Yep. Alright, now what would
They were the
Oh, Western
off-brand Cowboys.
I gotta do like lecture 200 and then 100 to 200 and 400 for less.
Alright, team 2.
Yeah.
Lecture turn? After the war, Southern congressmen and senators who had served as generals during the conflict tried to have themselves reseated in Congress. True. Very much so.
I can't tell.
Did not succeed, but they tried. So. Alright, team 2. Caleb.
Events. Well, wait, no, what do we do?
No, it's not even lecture, and then
That's 400.
100, then 200, and then 400 for
That's
less.
Yeah, that's what I meant.
Do it at 400.
It's in them.
Alright, the absolute end of the Civil War, Lee surrendered. The absolute end of the Civil War was Lee surrendered to Grant.
False.
Exactly, it is false. I should put it was there. So the question, just for the camera, is the absolute end of the Civil War was Lee surrendered to Grant? It was not. His surrender to Appomattox did officially end the war, but there were still battles being fought after that. So very good. Alright, so we're doing grab bag 200 next? Okay. Most Westerners favored this side during the Civil War because they needed the services that it provided.
The South?
No.
North?
The Union, the North. Yep. Because
Because it's not services, so
because
it's
of
like,
the industry in the North.
yeah.
So.
I just have tools.
Yep. Alright, final one, the Events 400. This act marched triumphantly through Congress in 1862 after Southerners had vetoed it numerous times before.
The Civil Rights Act?
Not quite, that'll be later. This is the Homestead Act. The Homestead Act. Okay. Alright, guys, so as far as that goes, we're going to go ahead and turn the camera off. I think the last thing we have this week is discussions. So, reminder from the camera, make sure you do those. Remember to have 3 full replies to 1 main post. Alrighty.